young woman fainted as the Blacktown doctor snapped her bones back into place, then married him after. They brought her in just after noon, when the sun was a hammer and the dust was a living thing that choked the air and settled on your tongue like grit. It wasn't a carriage that brought her, nothing so fine. Just a buckboard, the wood splintered and gray, and she was laid out on the back of it like a sack of unwanted grain. The two men who drove it didn't bother to get down, just hollered toward the small, neat house with the sign that read, Dr. Silas Thorne, Physician. One of them, a man with a face like a dried-out creek bed, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dirt. "Doc, got something for you." His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. There was no answer from the house for a long moment. The silence was heavy, thick with the heat and the buzzing of flies that had taken an interest in the girl on the buckboard. She wasn't moving. Her dress, once maybe a pale blue or a soft yellow, was now just a rag of indeterminate color, ripped and stained with things you didn't want to name. Her arm was bent at an angle that God never intended for a human limb, the bone nearly piercing the skin. One eye was swollen shut, a bruised and puffy mess. The other was open, but it wasn't seeing anything. It was just staring up at the cruel white sky. The dust had settled in her hair, matting the fine strands into dull ropes. You could smell the pain on her, a sharp metallic scent mixed with the sourness of sweat and fear. The man hollered again, impatient. "Thorne, you in there? This one's broke bad. Pa said to drop her here, said you'd know what to do." The pa he mentioned was Jedediah Miller, a man who owned half the county, and figured that meant he owned the people in it too. He bought and sold lives like he did cattle, and this girl, she was just another piece of stock that had gotten damaged. The door to the small house finally opened. The man who stood there was tall, his frame lean but solid. He was a black man, the only one for 100 miles who wasn't breaking his back in a field or serving someone else's dinner. Dr. Silas Thorne. He didn't speak. He just looked. His eyes took in the whole scene in a single sweeping glance. The rickety buckboard, the two callous men, and the broken girl. He wiped his hands on a clean cloth he held, his movements slow, deliberate. There was no rush in him, no panic, just a deep, quiet stillness that seemed to push back against the oppressive heat. He walked down the 3 steps of his porch, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He didn't look at the men. His focus was entirely on the girl. He reached the side of the buckboard and his long, clean fingers gently touched her uninjured wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was there, faint, a tiny, frightened bird beating against its cage. One of the men on the buckboard snorted. "She's alive, if that's what you're wondering. Tougher than she looks." Silas didn't acknowledge him. He was a man who had learned the power of silence, had weaponized it against a world that was always shouting. He let his silence hang in the air, a rebuke heavier than any curse word. He carefully examined her arm, his touch professional, distant, yet you could see a tension in his jaw. This wasn't the first time Miller had sent a broken thing his way. He was the town's refuse collector, the one they turned to when things got too ugly for them to look at. They paid him just enough to keep him here, a convenience for their own cruelty. He was their secret keeper, the repository for all the violence they committed behind closed doors and in dusty barns. The girl's open eye flickered, a tiny sign of life. A soft moan, no louder than a puff of wind, escaped her cracked lips. It was a sound of pure agony. Silas finally looked up at the two men, his gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "Get her inside," he said. His voice was a low baritone, calm but carrying an authority that made them shift uncomfortably. The man who had spat grumbled, "Ain't our job to move her." Silas just stared. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just waited. And in his waiting, there was a promise of something unbending. After a long, tense moment, the two men cursed under their breath and clumsily climbed down from the buckboard. They grabbed the girl, their hands rough, uncaring. She cried out, a thin, sharp sound of pain as they jostled her broken arm. Silas's jaw tightened even more, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Carefully," he said, the word clipped and cold as ice. They carried her up the steps and through the door into the cool, dim interior of his clinic, dumping her unceremoniously onto the examination table. The smell of antiseptic and herbs filled the air, a stark contrast to the dust and rot outside. They turned to leave. their duty done. But Silas's voice stopped them. The payment. The first man grunted, digging into his pocket and pulling out a few crumpled bills, tossing them onto a small table by the door. Miller said this'd cover it. It wasn't much, barely enough for the supplies he'd have to use. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the transaction, the finality of it. They were washing their hands of her. She was his problem now. As they left, a cloud of dust billowing in their wake, Silas closed the door, shutting out the cruel sun and the world that had done this to her. There was only the silence of the room, the girl's ragged breathing, and the quiet, simmering rage inside him. A rage he never, ever let show. He turned to her and the work began. I've got to take a quick pause here in the story. It's getting intense, I know. While I catch my breath, I'd love to know where you all are watching this from. Drop a comment down below and tell me the city or country. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And hey, if you're hooked already and want to see what happens to this girl and the doctor, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps out. Okay, let's get back to it. Dr. Silas Thorne was not a man given to sentiment. He was a man of bone and sinew, of tinctures and scalpels. He saw the world as a series of problems to be solved, and the young woman on his table was a complex one. He moved around her with a practiced economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch, if you weren't seeing the grim reality of his task. He lit a lamp, though the afternoon sun still slanted through the windows, because his work required precision, and he would not be hindered by shadows. He first took a pair of shears and carefully, methodically, cut away the tattered fabric of her sleeve, exposing the full, horrific damage to her arm. The bone, a stark white against the bruised and bloodied skin, had broken cleanly through the flesh. It was a compound fracture, dirty and dangerous. Infection was not a risk, it was a certainty if he didn't act fast. The girl was barely conscious, her good eye fluttering, lost in a haze of pain. He knew he should try to talk to her, to soothe her, but the words wouldn't come. Comfort was a language he had forgotten how to speak. Instead, he spoke in actions. He moved to a cabinet and took out a bottle of carbolic acid and clean linens. He poured a basin of water from a pitcher, the sound loud in the quiet room. He worked without a nurse, without an assistant. He'd learned long ago that he could only rely on his own two hands. He cleaned the wound first, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man of his size and disposition. He worked with a singular focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. The girl flinched and moaned, but she was too weak to pull away. Her breathing hitched, shallow and fast. He knew what was coming next would be the worst part, setting the bone. There was no ether, no chloroform in this dusty corner of the world. Not for the likes of her, anyway. There was only grit and the hope that she would pass out. He looked at her face, really looked at it for the first time. Beneath the grime and the swelling, she was young, terribly young, maybe 16, 17 years old. Her hair, where it wasn't matted with dirt, was the color of sun-bleached wheat. A spray of freckles across her nose was barely visible. A life barely started, already thrown away. He felt a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He couldn't afford pity. Pity was a luxury that dulled the senses and made the hand tremble, and his hand could not tremble. He moved to her side, his large hands hovering over her ruined arm. He didn't say, "This is going to hurt." She already knew that. Her whole world was hurt. Instead, he just said, his voice low and flat, "Hold still." He took hold of her arm, one hand gripping above the break, the other below. He ignored her sharp intake of breath, her whimper of terror. He focused on the feel of the bone, the grating of the broken ends. He pulled, a strong, steady traction aligning the jagged edges. The girl's body went rigid. A scream tore from her throat, raw and animalistic, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that seemed to shake the very walls of the small room. And then, with a sickening, wet snap that echoed in the silence, the bone slid back into place. Her scream cut off abruptly. Her body went limp on the table, her head lolled to the side. She had fainted, a small mercy. Silas let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His forehead was beaded with sweat. He didn't pause. He worked quickly now, splinting the arm with 2 smooth pieces of wood and wrapping it tightly with clean bandages. He was a machine of efficiency. Clean the wound, set the bone, splint the injury. That was the ritual. That was the work. When he was done, her arm was secure, immobile. He then turned his attention to the rest of her. He cleaned the cuts on her face, his touch methodical. He examined the swollen eye, seeing that there was no permanent damage to the eye itself, just severe bruising. He noted the pattern of bruises on her ribs, the chafing on her wrists, a story written in violence on her skin. He had read this story 100 times before. After a long while, he was finished. He stood back and looked at his work. The girl lay still on his table, a fragile thing held together by his stitches and splints. He had pieced her back together, but he knew the breaking was more than just bone deep. He picked her up, her weight almost nothing in his strong arms, and carried her from the clinic room into the small, attached living quarters. He had a spare room, hardly more than a closet with a narrow cot. He laid her down on it gently and pulled a thin, clean blanket over her. He stood there for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. He should have felt satisfaction, a job well done. Instead, he just felt tired, a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He had saved her body, but he had no idea what to do with her life, and he knew with a sinking certainty that her life was now tangled up with his. That night, the house was silent except for the sound of the girl's breathing and the simmering of a pot on the stove. Silas did not sit by her bedside. He did not watch over her like a worried father. He did what he always did when the world pressed in on him. He busied his hands. He took the stew he had been making for his own supper and added more water, more vegetables. He tore a loaf of bread into chunks. The actions were simple: grounding, measure, chop, stir. These were things he could control. The girl, she slept for hours, a deep, exhausted sleep that was the body's own best medicine. When she finally woke, it was dark outside. The only light came from the sliver under the door and the moonlight filtering through the small window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was a searing, white-hot pain and a sound like a branch snapping, and then nothing. Now there was only a dull, throbbing ache in her arm, which was bound tight to her chest. She pushed herself up slowly, her body screaming in protest. The room was small and bare, but it was clean. The air smelled of dried herbs and soap, not of dirt and sweat. She saw a glass of water on a small crate next to the cot. Her throat was parched, a desert. She reached for it with her good hand, her fingers trembling. The door opened. The tall doctor stood there, silhouetted against the light from the other room. He held a bowl in his hands. He didn't say anything, just walked in and set the bowl down on the crate next to the water. It was the stew. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of meat and onions. She stared at him, her one good eye wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Men had never given her anything without wanting something in return. Food was a weapon, a tool of control. He saw the look in her eye and seemed to understand. He didn't push. He just pointed a thumb back towards the main room. Eat it, or don't. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the semi-darkness. She stared at the bowl for a long time. Her stomach growled, a painful, hollow cramp. She was starving. Slowly, cautiously, she picked up the spoon he had left. It was heavy, real silver, not tin. She dipped it into the stew and brought it to her lips. It was hot and savory, and the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, ravenously, not stopping until the bowl was scraped clean. The simple act of eating a full meal, of feeling warmth spread through her belly, was so foreign it almost made her cry. But the tears wouldn't come. She hadn't cried in a long, long time. Later he returned. He didn't knock. He just entered, carrying the basin of water again, along with more clean cloths and a jar of salve. He put them down without a word and gestured for her to sit up. Warily she did. He unwrapped the bandages on her face, his movements precise and impersonal. He gently cleaned the cuts again, dabbing them with the cool, soothing salve. His fingers were calloused, but his touch was light. He worked in silence, and she watched him in silence. She watched his hands. They were big, capable hands, hands that could set a bone with terrifying strength, but could also apply a salve with the delicacy of a painter. He didn't look at her face, only at his work. When he was done, he gathered his things. He paused at the door. There's a privy out back. The water pump is next to it. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Don't wander off. Miller's men are liable to be watching. It wasn't a warning born of concern. It was a statement of fact, a practical piece of advice. Then he was gone again. She was left alone with the throbbing in her arm and the unfamiliar feeling of a full stomach. She didn't know this man's name. She didn't know why he was helping her. But as she lay back down on the clean cot in the quiet, safe room, she knew one thing. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't sleeping in the dirt. Trust wasn't built on words. It wasn't built on promises. For someone like her, it was built on things you could see and feel. It was built on a splint that held a bone straight. It was built on a bowl of hot stew. It was built on the simple, powerful ritual of a wound being cleaned. It was a language of action, and she was slowly, cautiously beginning to understand it. For 2 days they existed in this strange, silent rhythm. He would work in his clinic during the day, the sounds of his movements a constant presence on the other side of the wall. He would bring her food 3 times a day, simple meals of beans or bread and broth, leaving them by her cot without a word. He would come in the evening to clean her wounds and check the splint. He never asked her name. She never offered it. She was just the girl, and he was just the doctor. On the 3rd day, the silence was finally broken. Not by him, but by her. He had brought her a bowl of thin corn gruel for breakfast. As he turned to leave, her voice, raspy from disuse, stopped him. My pa, he sold me. The words came out in a rush, a clumsy, broken confession. Silas stopped in the doorway, his back still to her. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, waiting. She took his silence as permission to continue, the story tumbling out of her like water from a burst dam. A long, rambling tale of a failed farm, of debts owed to Jedediah Miller, of a father who looked at her and saw not a daughter, but a commodity. He didn't have no more cattle to give Miller, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. So he gave him me, told me I was to work it off, cook and clean for his ranch hands. She picked at a loose thread on the blanket with her good hand. One of them, he got drunk. He didn't like the supper I made, said it was burnt. It wasn't burnt. She paused, the memory playing behind her good eye. He got mad, grabbed my arm, twisted it. I heard it pop. Then the others, they joined in. She looked up at the doctor's broad back. When they was done, Miller came out. He looked at me on the floor, said I was no good to him now, said I was damaged goods. He told them to take me to the Black Dock, said you'd patch me up or bury me. He didn't care which. She finished her story, and the room was filled once again with a heavy silence. She had expected him to say something, to offer a word of pity maybe, or to tell her it wasn't her fault. He did neither. He finally turned around, his face unreadable. He looked at her. Then his eyes drifted to a small, framed photograph on his wall. It was a picture of a woman, a beautiful woman with kind eyes, and a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing beside her. Silas's son, his late wife. My wife, Sarah, he said, his voice quiet. He hadn't planned on saying it. The words just came. She got sick, a fever that wouldn't break. The doctor in the town we lived in before, a white man, he wouldn't come. Said he didn't treat our kind. I was just a student then, reading medical books. I did everything I could, everything I had read, but I didn't know enough. She died. He looked back at the girl on the cot. After that, I went to medical school, a proper one up north. Took me twice as long, cost me twice as much as anyone else. But I finished. I learned how to fix what's broken. He gestured around the small, sparse clinic. I came here because they needed a doctor, and they were desperate enough to take me. But they don't see a doctor. They see a pair of hands, convenient hands to clean up their messes. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was just stating facts. His story was as blunt and unadorned as hers. 2 different lives, 2 different paths, but both scarred by the casual cruelty of others. A shared geography of pain. The ghosts of his past met the ghosts of hers in the quiet space between them. He had his wife he couldn't save. She had a family that sold her, wounds that went deeper than any broken bone. He picked up the empty bowl from the night before. The fever that took my wife, he said, his hand on the doorknob. They called it swamp fever. It was just pneumonia, easily treated if anyone had bothered to try. And with that, he left, leaving her with his own raw, unhealed wound. An understanding, rough-hewn and unspoken, had been forged between them. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't kindness, it was a mutual recognition of survival. They were two people the world had tried to break, and they were both, in their own stubborn ways, still standing. The first real threat came not from Miller or his men, but from the sky itself. A storm had been brewing on the horizon for days, a bruised purple stain that bled across the endless blue. On the 5th night of her stay, it broke. The wind came first, a low moan that rattled the window panes and clawed at the roof. Then the rain, not a gentle shower, but a solid wall of water that hit the dry earth with a hiss. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it felt like the sky was splitting apart, and lightning lit up the small house in stark, terrifying flashes. The girl, who had been sleeping, cried out and sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. The fury of the storm was too much like the fury of the men. Unreasoning, violent, overwhelming. The door to her room flew open. It was Silas. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the window, which was bowing inward under the force of the wind. "Get up," he ordered, his voice sharp over the roar of the storm. "The window latch is broken. It won't hold." He was already moving, grabbing a hammer and some nails from his tool chest. She scrambled off the cot, her splinted arm held tight against her chest, her bare feet cold on the wood floor. Another gust of wind hit the house, and with a crack of splintering wood, the window shattered, spewing glass and a torrent of rain into the room. The wind howled through the opening, tearing at the blanket on the cot, sending papers flying in his clinic. It was chaos, dark, wet, loud. Silas didn't flinch. He grabbed a heavy wooden shutter he kept for just this purpose. "Here, hold this," he yelled, shoving one end of it towards her. She grabbed it with her good hand, her knuckles white. The force of the wind pushing against it was immense. It took all her strength to keep it from being ripped from her grasp. Rain lashed her face, plastering her thin shift to her skin. She was shaking from cold or fear or both. Silas worked with a frantic, focused energy, hammering. The sound of the blows was swallowed by the storm. Bang, bang, bang. He was trying to nail the shutter over the broken window from the inside. A flash of lightning illuminated his face, grim and determined, his shirt soaked through. He was a force of nature himself, pushing back against the storm's rage. The wind shoved. She staggered, almost losing her grip. "Hold it steady," he barked, not looking at her. She dug her heels in, leaning her whole body into the shutter. Not just a broken girl anymore. She was part of the defense, a piece of the wall. Together they were fighting the storm. His strength and her desperation. A raw, survivalist unity forged in the heart of the tempest. Finally, with one last, powerful blow, the final nail went in. The shutter held. The howling of the wind was muffled, the deluge of rain cut off. The sudden quiet in the room was almost as shocking as the noise had been. They stood there for a moment, panting in the dark, the only sound the drumming of rain on the roof and their own ragged breaths. Water dripped from their hair and clothes, pooling on the floor around them. He finally turned to her. In the dim light he could see she was trembling, but her jaw was set. She hadn't let go. "Good," was all he said. The word was a small, solid thing in the midst of the chaos. It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement. She had held her ground. They had held the line together. He went and lit a lamp, the flame chasing the worst of the shadows away. He looked at her, soaked and shivering, a stray piece of glass glittering in her hair. He left and came back a moment later with a thick, dry blanket. He didn't wrap it around her. He just handed it to her. Another practical gesture, an offering of warmth without the complication of touch. She took it, wrapping it tightly around her small frame. They had survived the first threat. It wasn't men with guns, but it was a force just as destructive, and they had faced it together. A silent partnership, cemented by a shattered window and a shared fight against the wind and the rain. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and shining. The air was cool and fresh, and the dust was, for a time, settled. In the quiet days that followed, the bond between the doctor and the girl deepened, not through words, but through shared tasks and silent companionship. He was a man of routines, and slowly, she became a part of them. In the mornings, he would grind herbs with a mortar and pestle, the rhythmic thud a steady heartbeat in the house. One morning, he gestured for her to sit opposite him. He pushed a small pile of dried yarrow leaves towards her. "Grind this," he said, "fine as dust." He showed her how to hold the pestle with her good hand, how to use a circular motion to break down the tough leaves. At first she was clumsy, her movements jerky, but she watched him, mimicking the steady, patient rhythm of his hands. Soon they were working together, the sound of their two pestles a quiet, percussive conversation. Thud-thump, thud-thump. She learned the names of the plants not by reading but by smell and touch. Comfrey for mending bone, willow bark for pain, chamomile for soothing a restless spirit. He was teaching her his trade, his language. He was giving her a tool, a piece of knowledge that was hers to keep. She, in turn, found ways to help. She couldn't scrub or lift with her arm in a splint, but she could sit at the table and sort beans, picking out the small stones. She could stir a pot with her good hand. She could sweep the porch with slow, careful movements. They were small things, but they were contributions. She was no longer just a patient, a piece of broken cargo. She was becoming a part of the household. One afternoon, a horse in a nearby pasture had gotten tangled in a length of barbed wire. The owner, a poor farmer who couldn't afford a veterinarian, came to Silas. Silas was a doctor of men, but in a place like this, you learn to be a doctor of all living things. He went out to the field, and the girl, Ilara, though he did not yet know her name, followed at a distance. The horse was wild with panic and pain, its eyes rolling, its legs kicking out. The farmer was useless, wringing his hands and shouting. Silas approached the animal with that same unnerving calm he seemed to bring to every crisis. He spoke to it in a low, steady murmur, not words of comfort, but just sound, a constant, soothing rumble. He moved slowly, letting the horse get used to his presence. The wire was wrapped tight around its hind leg, the barbs digging deep into its flesh. Silas needed to get close to cut it, but it was too dangerous. The horse was a coiled spring of fear. Ilara watched from the fence line. She saw the tension in the horse, the frustration in the farmer, the deep, focused patience in the doctor. Without thinking, she walked over to the small patch of clover growing by the fence. She picked a large handful with her good arm and walked slowly, quietly towards the horse's head, holding the clover out. Silas saw her out of the corner of his eye but didn't stop her. The horse's ears twitched. It saw the green offering, smelled it. Its frantic movements slowed. It was still wary, but the promise of a treat was a powerful distraction. It stretched its neck and lipped the clover from her hand, its whiskers soft against her palm. That was the moment Silas needed. While the horse was distracted, he moved in swiftly, his wire cutter snipping through the tough metal with a single, clean snap. The wire fell away. The horse, suddenly free, shied back, then stood trembling, its ordeal over. The farmer rushed forward, full of loud thanks. Silas ignored him. He looked at Ilara, who was still standing by the horse's head, her hand outstretched as if still holding the clover. Their eyes met over the animal's back. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, a thank you. They were a team. He was the stone, solid and unyielding. She was the fire, a small, quiet flame that could soothe a panicked beast. They walked back to the house together, the farmer's voice fading behind them. They didn't speak of what had happened. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet strength. They were two solitary creatures who had, against all odds, learned to hunt together. The fragile peace they had built within the four walls of his home could not last. The world outside was always waiting, suspicious and cruel. When Ilara's arm was healed enough that the splint could be replaced with a simple sling, Silas knew they couldn't stay hidden away forever. They needed supplies, flour, salt, kerosene, things that could only be bought in town. The town was a single dusty street lined with a handful of weathered, false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a church whose paint was peeling like sunburnt skin. Walking down that street with Ilara at his side was like walking through a gauntlet of stairs. Every window seemed to have a face in it. Every porch rocker seemed to stop its creaking. The silence was thick with judgment. He was the town's black doctor, an anomaly they tolerated out of necessity. She was the white girl he'd taken in, the one Miller had discarded. Their presence together was a violation of the unspoken rules, a disruption to the town's ugly, carefully balanced order. In the general store, the air was heavy with the smell of pickles and dust. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson with small, piggy eyes, watched them as they gathered their goods. He didn't speak to them, just tallied their purchases with pursed lips. Two women were standing by the fabric bolts pretending to look at Calico. Their whispers were sharp and clear in the quiet store. "Look at that. Shameless. Jedediah Miller ought to run him out of town for this. Keeping a white girl in his house. She ain't right in the head, you ask me. Look at her. Like a stray dog he picked up." Alara flinched, her shoulders hunching. She tried to make herself smaller, to disappear. She stared hard at the floorboards, her face pale. Silas heard every word. He didn't turn, he didn't raise his voice. He simply finished placing his items on the counter. He met Henderson's gaze, his own eyes flat and cold. "That all you gotta say, Henderson?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the storekeeper look down. Henderson grumbled, sweeping their goods into a sack. "That'll be $2.40. Silas placed the coins on the counter, one by one. Each click of metal on wood was a punctuation mark, a defiance. He took the sack, turned, and walked out, Alara trailing in his wake like a shadow. The women fell silent as he passed, refusing to meet his eyes. Outside, the whispers were replaced by open stares. The town sheriff, a burly man named Calloway with a drooping mustache, was leaning against a post outside his office. He watched them approach, his expression a mixture of contempt and curiosity. He pushed himself off the post, blocking their path. "Thorne," he said, the name an accusation. "Calloway," Silas replied, his tone even. Calloway tipped his hat back, hooking his thumbs in his belt. He looked from Silas to Alara and back again, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you got yourself some live-in help." The insinuation was thick and greasy. Silas's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. "She's a patient, recovering." "Funny kind of recovering," Calloway said, his eyes lingering on Alara. "Living under your roof, people are talking. They don't like it." "I don't much care what people like," Silas said, his voice dropping lower. "I care about my patients. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have to get back." He made to step around the sheriff, but Calloway shifted, blocking him again. "Just a friendly warning, Thorne. This town has its ways. You'd do well to remember that. Send the girl on her way before there's trouble." Silas looked the sheriff dead in the eye. He didn't say a word. He just held his gaze, a silent battle of wills fought in the dusty street. For a long moment, nobody moved. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Calloway stepped aside. He had seen something in the doctor's eyes that he didn't want to challenge. Not today, anyway. Silas walked past him without another glance, Alara hurrying to keep up. The walk back to his house was long and silent. The sack of flour felt heavy in his hand. He had wanted to be left alone, to live his life on the edges, invisible. But by taking her in, by saving her, he had stepped into the light. And the light in a town like this attracted predators. The breaking point came a week later. It was a Sunday. The church bell was ringing, calling the good people of the town to worship, to pray for forgiveness for sins they'd spend the next 6 days committing all over again. Silas was in his small garden behind the house, checking on the meager rows of vegetables he fought to keep alive in the hard-packed soil. Alara was on the porch, mending one of his shirts with small, neat stitches. She was getting good with a needle. A buckboard rattled up the road, the same one that had brought her. But this time it wasn't just two of Miller's hands. It was Jedediah Miller himself. He was a big man, florid-faced and running to fat, but he carried himself with the unshakable arrogance of a man who owned everything he saw. He pulled the horses to a halt and sat there for a moment, surveying the small house as if it were an insect he was contemplating squashing. The two ranch hands who had brought Alara the first time sat beside him, their faces smug. Miller climbed down from the buckboard, his boots sinking into the dirt. "Thorne," he bellowed. Silas straightened up from his garden, wiping his hands on his trousers. He walked around the side of the house to face Miller, his expression a careful, neutral mask. He had made a vow to himself long ago, a code he lived by. Stay quiet, stay separate, do not get involved. Involvement meant trouble. It meant pain. It meant reminding the world he existed. And that was always a dangerous thing to do. "Miller," Silas said, his voice even. Ilara had frozen on the porch, the shirt clutched in her hands, her face ashen. She looked like a cornered animal. Miller ignored Silas for a moment, his eyes fixing on Ilara. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, look at you. He patched you up right pretty. Almost good as new." He turned his attention back to Silas. "I've come for my property, Thorn. The girl's had long enough to heal. Time for her to come back and earn her keep." Silas stood his ground. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. This was the moment his code was being tested. He could hand her over. It would be the easy thing to do. The safe thing. No more trouble from the town. No more whispers. He could go back to his quiet, solitary life. "She's not property, Miller," Silas said, the words low and clear. Miller laughed, a harsh barking sound. "I got a bill of sale says otherwise. Her own Pia signed it. She belongs to me. Now send her out." "No," Silas said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a stone. Miller's smile vanished. His face darkened with rage. "What did you say to me?" "I said no," Silas repeated. "She's not going anywhere." Miller took a step forward, his hand dropping to the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "You're forgetting your place, Thorn. I own this town. That includes you. Now you'll give me the girl or I'll have my boys drag her out and you with her." The two ranch hands started to climb down from the buckboard, their movements slow and menacing. This was it. The line. For years, Silas had absorbed the insults, the contempt, the quiet injustices. He had swallowed his pride, kept his head down, and simply endured. But looking at Ilara, pale and terrified on the porch, something inside him broke. A lifetime of disciplined non-involvement shattered in an instant. He took one step forward, placing himself directly between Miller and the porch, between Miller and Ilara. It was a simple movement, but it was a declaration. He was no longer on the sidelines. "You will not touch her," he said. His voice was different now. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something cold and hard as iron. Miller, enraged by the defiance, lunged forward, his hand reaching out to shove Silas aside and grab for the girl. He never made it. Silas moved with a speed that was shocking. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply brought his open hand up and shoved the heel of his palm hard into Miller's chest, right over his heart. It was a doctor's blow, precise and brutally effective. All the air rushed out of Miller's lungs in a whoosh. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and tripped over his own feet, landing hard in the dust with a heavy thud. The two ranch hands froze, their hands hovering over their own guns, stunned into inaction. They had never seen anyone, let alone a black man, lay a hand on Jedediah Miller. Silas stood over the gasping, winded man, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had crossed the line. He had broken his own code. In front of the whole town on a Sunday morning, he had physically defended this girl. He had publicly claimed her, and in the sudden ringing silence, he knew there was no going back. That night, the house was a fortress of silence. The confrontation had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Miller, humiliated and breathless, had been helped back onto his buckboard by his stunned men and had retreated, vowing revenge. But for now, they were gone. Silas sat at his small kitchen table staring at his hands. The same hands that stitched wounds and ground herbs had struck a man. He felt a tremor in them, a vibration of rage and fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had maintained his peace through detachment, and now that detachment was gone, leaving him raw and exposed. He had painted a target on his own back and on hers. Ilara came and stood in the doorway, a ghost in the lamplight. She didn't speak for a long time, just watched him. The terror from the afternoon had been replaced by a new look in her eye, something quiet and solemn. She had seen him stand for her. She had seen him risk everything he had, his safety, his precarious place in this community for her. No one had ever done that. She walked over to the table and sat down in the chair opposite him. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of what had happened, of the choice he had made. "They always called me girl," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear it. Miller did. His men. Even my pa, at the end. Just girl. She looked down at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. Her good hand. The one that had learned to grind herbs. The one that had held out clover to a frightened horse. They never used my name. It was like they were trying to rub it off me, you know? Like if they said it enough, girl, 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 I'd forget who I was supposed to be. Silas looked up from his own hands and met her gaze. Her good eye was clear, and for the first time he saw not just a victim, not just a patient, but a person looking back at him. Complete. Whole. He had mended her bone. But this moment, this was something else. This was the mending of a soul. She took a breath, a small, steadying thing. "My name," she said, the words simple, unadorned, but carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "My name is Ilara." She said it as if offering a gift, the most precious thing she owned. Her identity, herself. He had seen her broken, terrified, and defiant. He had seen her fight a storm and soothe a beast. But he had never known her. Not until this moment. He let the name settle in the quiet room. Ilara. It was a beautiful name. It felt solid, real. He repeated it, his voice a low rumble. Ilara. The act of him speaking it was profound. It was a recognition, an acceptance. He was not just saying a name. He was giving her back a piece of herself that the world had tried to steal. She gave him a small, watery smile. The first real smile he had ever seen on her face. It transformed her, chasing away the last of the shadows. In that moment of shared vulnerability, a final wall between them crumbled. He had confessed his past to her with the story of his wife. She had now confessed her true self to him with the gift of her name. They were no longer just a doctor and a patient, a savior and a victim. They were Silas and Ilara. Two names, two people, standing together against a world that wanted them to be nameless. He felt the trembling in his hands subside. He had broken his code of non-involvement, but maybe it was a code that needed to be broken. Maybe detachment wasn't peace. Maybe it was just another kind of prison. And for the first time, sitting in the lamplight across from a girl named Ilara, he felt something like freedom. The days that followed were tense. The town watched them, waiting. Miller was nursing his bruised pride and, Silas knew, plotting his revenge. The threat was a constant low hum in the background of their lives. But inside the small house, something had shifted. Naming her had changed everything. Ilara was not a patient to be cared for. She was a partner to live alongside. The silence between them became comfortable, companionable. The routines they had built became less about survival and more about creating a life, however fragile. One morning, Silas went to the small, hard patch of earth behind his house where his garden struggled. He held a small cloth bag in his hand. Ilara followed him out, her sling now gone, her arm still weak but usable. She watched as he knelt and began to clear the patch of weeds, his strong hands pulling them up by the roots. He didn't ask for her help, but she knelt beside him and began to do the same, her movements careful but determined. They worked together under the morning sun, clearing the ground, preparing it. When they were finished, he opened the small cloth bag. Inside were seeds, small, dark, and full of promise. "Pumpkin seeds," he said, pouring a few into her palm. "My wife, Sarah, she loved pumpkin pie." It was a simple statement, a memory shared without ceremony. He took a stick and poked a series of shallow holes in the newly cleared earth. He showed her how to drop 2 seeds into each hole. "You plant 2, he explained, his voice practical, like a teacher. "One for the crows, one to grow." It was a blunt metaphor for their lives, a recognition of the world's harshness, but also an act of faith, a belief that something, against all odds, might just survive. She carefully dropped the seeds into the holes he had made. Her fingers, once strangers to anything but hardship, were now part of an act of creation. He then showed her how to gently cover the holes with soil, patting the earth down firmly. When they were done, they stood and looked at their work. It was just a small patch of disturbed dirt, nothing to look at, but beneath the surface there was a secret, a potential for life, a seed of belonging. He picked up the watering can and handed it to her. She took it and gently watered the patch, the cool water darkening the soil, sealing their work. This was their declaration, not a marriage of vows and rings, but a marriage of shared purpose. They were planting roots in a place that did not want them. They were building a future in the shadow of a threat. They were two broken people who had found a way to grow something new together. As she finished watering, she looked up at him, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The sun was warm on their backs. For the first time, this small plot of land, this small house, felt like a home. They had faced the world's cruelty and answered it not with more violence, but with a quiet, defiant act of hope. They had planted a garden. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by hitting that like button. And for more stories that you won't forget, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.